So hello everyone, and thank you for coming to our first MS&E Black Alumni panel session hosted by the Department of Management Science and Engineering and MS&E Career Collaborative Program at Stanford. My name is Linda Esquivel, and I'm your host and moderator for today's event. I'm also the Career and Affiliate Services Officer for the department. It's my pleasure to welcome back and introduce our panelists and MS&E alums, Stephanie Lampkin, founder and CEO of Blendoor, Trybe White, Senior Technical Product Manager at Amazon Web Services, Maya Havard, Product Manager at Dropbox, and Thomas Igeme, Head of People Development at ServiceNow and co-founder of Trybe.ai. So I will pass on the torch to Stephanie.
So I like to do a little bit of visual storytelling when I talk about my story or intro, whatever. I do this a lot and for speaking engagements and pitching. So, it just helps to kind of spark questions around my journey. So I'll start from the beginning. I'm from Southeast Washington, D.C. This is a picture of my first birthday party. If you look really closely, you can see a 40 ounce in the background. So yeah, mom's was turning up. But yeah, so I am actually the product of a mom who was homeless at one point and even battled a drug and alcohol addiction. But as fate would have it, we moved to the DC area to live with my aunt, who was a computer science major in undergrad at the University of Maryland College Park. So I started coding pretty early. I was a full stack developer by 15, took AP computer science and a bunch of STEM AP courses in high school, such that got into Stanford. While at Stanford, I participated in NSBE, Society of Women Engineers, BASES. I had a Fortune 500 internship every summer through Inroads, such that I was able to land a job at Microsoft. And pretty early on at Microsoft, I saw very limited career trajectory opportunities, just signals in a few different ways that I wouldn't grow there. So I quit after about 5.5 years and then went on to MIT to get an MBA. And about 6 months after I graduated from MIT, I applied for an analytical lead job at Google and made it through the final rounds. Thought everything was great, and they came back and told me I wasn't technical enough. And this is with a MS&E degree from Stanford and an MIT MBA. They just figured I wasn't good enough. So I sort of took my non-technical self, according to Google, and built the first version of Blendoor, which is a enterprise software that mitigates unconscious bias in hiring and thus enabling companies to hire and retain a diverse workforce. So we leverage AI and people analytics to make that process a lot more efficient. And we've won a ton of really awesome awards, got on a few covers of magazines, but ran into challenges with venture capital. Only about 2% of venture capital goes to women, and divide that by 100 is the percentage of venture capital that goes to Black women. So in my free time, which is very little, I founded this organization called Visible Figures, which represents all of the Black women in tech that have raised venture capital. So it started off as about 30 of us. Now we're up to 160, and just growing and scaling, because fundamentally, this is what we think about when we think about tech and innovation. If you recognize this guy in the far right corner, Kevin Systrom was my MS&E classmate, class of 2006, who went on to found Instagram. So, my entrepreneurial journey has obviously been a lot different than Kevin's, but just really confident that my Stanford education, my career trajectory can enable me to build technology that makes more opportunities for people that don't look like this. That's it.
That's a hard one to beat, Stephanie. Thank you so much for sharing that. I couldn't agree with Nitin more. Very, very inspiring. I love that you started kind of way at the beginning. I'll follow that lead. While I've been in the US for a number of years, was actually born and raised in Kenya. And actually grew up very poor in Kenya. And I mention that because that's been really instrumental in my professional journey. And so kind of like a lot of immigrants, I came over to the US at 18, kind of hoping for a better life. I taught myself to take the SATs, and I actually got a diversity scholarship to Stanford, money that had been earmarked by donors who really wanted to try and see a more diverse Stanford from an immigrant perspective. And so I got here very excitedly, and really that was the opportunity that really began to shift things, not just for me and my family. I came with exactly $273 to my name. I remember it like it was yesterday. I tell you, $273 goes a lot further in Nairobi, Kenya, than it does at Stanford. But Stanford was a wonderfully supportive place to be in. It's really great when, you know, your financial aid covers stuff at the dining hall that will kind of help it go through. But I was an MS&E major. Like did my concentration was in policy and strategy. I actually started off in academic research thanks to the work at MS&E with a real focus on sub-Saharan Africa. But I kind of in that process, looking at economic policy, I started really figuring out that like private sector was going to be pretty important as we thought about development, and felt like I'd not really developed any awareness of that world. And so I shifted into management consulting, which had two benefits. The first of which was, it was kind of, I said it was kind of going to be like an MBA for me. I wanted to get a sense of the business world. It also was the first time I could actually support my family back home. And actually off of that experience in management consulting, not only did I learn a ton about what was going on, but both my sisters were able to eventually come over to the States for tertiary education. One's a doctor, the other works as a diversity inclusion management consultant with Bain and Company. And I mention that because the opportunity to kind of go from where I started with basically nothing, $273 to my name, to now seeing the impact of education, not just on me and my family, is really the story that I've really built my career around trying to scale. And how do you leverage learning in more scalable ways to make that happen? And so worked in product at LinkedIn for a number of years, really focused on building sales coaching products. I co-founded Trybe.ai. Definitely have some horror stories from trying to raise VC as a Black founder. Stephanie, I'm sure I can ask you for some advice there. Kind of still going on to that, moved into a board role in that function this year, and now work as head of people manager development for ServiceNow. It's a large, fast-growing tech company here in the Bay. Just in all of those places, very different skills, but always thinking about how do we leverage learning and development to really level the playing field and ensure that everyone gets a chance to succeed.
There's a lot to follow, but hi everybody, I'm Maya. I went to Stanford for my master's, where obviously I studied MS&E. I concentrated in technology and engineering management, and also computational social science. And I guess I'll just tell the story of how I got there. So before Stanford, I went to Spelman College, which is a historically Black college in Atlanta. I got there and I wanted to study math. I wanted to go into finance and business. And I took this one computer science course because it was a prereq and it was like required for the math major my first semester freshman year. And I took it and I was like, oh my goodness, this is like super duper hard. But it was like kind of interesting to me because like it felt like a actual way I could apply the logic I was learning in math. I was like, I can like build something. I had no idea what it was before going in. And then the next year I took like another one. And my professor was like, oh, you know what? You're like, you know, kind of good at this. Like maybe you should major in it. And I was like, oh no, it's okay. Like I want to go into business. I'm a math major. I'm very happy with that. And she basically was like, no, like you're in my department now. Like you're going to be a CS major. So I called my mom. I'm like, Mom, my professor said like I'm gonna be a CS major, like a computer science major. My mom is like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know what that is. I know what math is. I don't know what CS is. And she literally said, like, I don't know if they make a lot of money from that. I don't know what you're gonna do with that. So I ended up having to double major in math and CS because my mom wouldn't let me drop the math major. And I kind of tell that story just because I think like panels like this and seeing people in these types of roles and this type of awareness is super important, because if I didn't have somebody kind of tell me what computer science was or tell me like, you know, you could be good at it, I probably wouldn't be doing the same thing I'm doing today. And I had a similar story for grad school, somebody just saying you should definitely apply. And I remember applying to Stanford mainly because of the computational social science concentration. I thought it sounded super cool. Not really because it was Stanford per se. I didn't really think I would like get into a school as cool as Stanford, and somebody pushed me to apply. And obviously I got in and I'm here. But I just had to say that I feel like the fact that y'all came to this panel and the fact that we have this kind of like community here, and we can all tell our stories, I think that's super awesome, because I know in the past I really could use these stories. And so I'm so happy that y'all are here and that we can share our stories with y'all. Oh, and currently I'm a product manager at Dropbox. So that's why I did after Stanford.
Last but not least, Tyreek.
Hi, yeah, these are definitely tough shoes to follow. But hi, everyone. I'm Tyreek, and I'm gonna do Maya. Thanks for queuing me up for your structure because I really like that. So I'm gonna start with the latest. So I graduated from MS&E in 2018, and I concentrated in energy and the environment. And before that, I went to Harvard where I majored in applied math. And I like exactly what you said about someone, presenting an opportunity to you, Maya, because I believe my journey with the sciences goes as far back as like when I was in 4th grade. And I remember vividly having this conversation with my uncle. I'd always been naturally inclined with verbal reasoning and literature. And I just knew that I was going to do something in English or art or something. And I remember my uncle saying, Tyreek, you're good at English and that's cool, but you should, like, what are you going to do with an English degree? That's not going to do anything for you. You should really try to be good at math. And 4th grade me, who was eager to please and eager to be the best at everything, was like, all right, let's be good at math now. So I remember pivoting and then following down the STEM path to all the way up until undergrad. And what I do between undergrad and Stanford. So senior year, which is the year everyone of undergrad is trying to find what they're going to do for the next couple of years. And at Harvard, it's very common for people to go into consulting or finance, investment banking, whatever. And I remember sitting in those waiting rooms with other candidates, a lot of them who didn't look like me. And I was looking around us in our suits, waiting to do these case interviews that we'd prepped for all night, all week, all month. And I was like, I think I'm here because all of these other people are here. And this seems like the next right step, but I don't think this is the next right step for me. So what I ended up doing is I ended up going through all of those recruiting processes, and I got some offers. But again, December 2014, I remember having a very difficult conversation with my aunt, and I was like, I don't want to do this. I want to go abroad and figure out what I actually want to do. So long story short, I ended up going to Poland on a Fulbright where I taught English and kind of just traveled Europe to figure out what I really wanted to do. And along the way, I kind of realized that, hey, the finance consulting route wasn't for me, but I really liked a lot of the technology stuff I was doing in undergrad. And I think I can really have an impact there. And again, a lot of points I can remember that were pivotal in which I said, do I want an MBA or do I want to go down the MS&E track? And I'm really glad I went MS&E because I got to, beef up my business acumen while also becoming more technical. And from there, I went to Microsoft like Stephanie, and then after that, I am now at Amazon. So a lot of forks in the road on my journey to here, but happy to be here and talking with everyone.
Well, thank you everyone for giving an introduction. So we're going to start off with some questions, and then towards the end, we'll open it up to our attendees to ask questions. And the first question is, I think the first question we kind of answered already, but we can go on to the next question, which is, how has your experience at Stanford prepared you for your career?
I can start. I don't think I said this before, but I just graduated Stanford in 2019. So like I said, I came from Spelman. I was really interested. I did some engineering internships, but I was particularly interested in product management. And if y'all know a lot about product management, like the interviews can be like a little bit difficult. It's kind of hard to figure out. And so when I got to Stanford, there were so many resources for like just PM. And that was something that I didn't have at like my smaller undergrad institution. I took like a product management fundamentals class. And then even a lot of my other MS&E classes were very product development like focused. And I took marketing classes and design classes and even like a storytelling class, which really helped me with like my communication skills. And so I think MS&E in particular, like really helped me prepare for all the different like skills you need to become a successful PM. And then of course, also just simply for the interview. And those were like a lot of the resources I just simply didn't have at my smaller undergrad. So I think it had like a huge part in me preparing.
I can go. I was thinking through this a little bit earlier. Thank you for the heads up, Linda. And three things kind of stood out for me as I was thinking through what how Stanford prepared me. I think the first is intellectual humility. I came to Stanford thinking, and actually this occurred in the classroom, but even more outside the classroom. I came to Stanford really having one worldview and then interacting with people who thought completely different from me, and yet could very much justify their beliefs. And it was actually outside the classroom in terms of that thinking where I realized it was possible for me to be deeply earnest and yet deeply wrong. And so it was always incumbent on me to really listen to understand, not just listen to rebut. And I think that that kind of lens in life has like helped me through every stage of my career. I think it is actually really rare for people to sit in a room and truly be listening to understand you versus listening to just rebut. And if you can kind of make that as part of your brand, it's something that goes a long way. And I think it's something that I've over the years allowed to define me. I think the second is just what it means like to rely on community. I think like many people at Stanford, like especially many people who are underrepresented minorities. So as we think about the Black experience at Stanford, you are probably a trailblazer in a whole host of ways. That like you got where you are because you learned how to survive on your own and there weren't too many people around you to like ask for advice. And that was very my story as well. And so learning to ask for help, what it looks like to have a community around me I can rely on that can push me forward in my intellectual and career pursuits wasn't even something I'd considered before Stanford. And yet, you know, like they always say, if your dreams don't require help, you're probably not thinking big enough. And so that opportunity to really learn how to rely on others and have them push me was like really helpful. And I'd say for me, like the third thing, is an opportunistic mindset. Coming from my background, I was very used to lack. I was honestly overwhelmed by how much existed at Stanford, how many resources there were, how much money went into things. But I think this idea that like there's actually probably a way to get done whatever I could dream of. And it's about me learning to ask the right questions and figuring out who the right person to ask those questions of is. Whether it's about, you know, when I was starting, trying to figure out like, how am I going to get to do the research project I want over the summer and get paid to do it, to like now thinking about like, well, who am I going to go out to ask for money to raise? Or who am I going to go and ask for an intro to get that job?
Yeah, I can go next if you don't mind, Linda.
Yes, go.
I think, yeah, so one thing that Stanford has in common with a lot of the other, you know, some of the top schools in the US is that everyone's obviously incredibly intelligent. And it goes beyond intelligence. There are a lot of people who just are so kind, so compassionate, do so much and ask for little. And it's very hard to feel kind of, as Thomas said, you learn to have a certain degree of humility. But with that being said, Stanford also taught me to not hold back or to fight for what I truly believe in. And that translates a lot into work too, because similar to Stanford, you recognize right away in the meeting that you're probably not the smartest person in the room. But even if you're not the smartest person in the room on paper, I believe Stanford taught me how to figure out what I can contribute to the conversation. So to apply it specifically to work, we can be talking, I can be in a call with directors and our VP who have, you know, 10, 20 years of work experience. And on paper, they're, you know, they have done everything they needed to do to be successful. But as a product manager, it's my job as someone who's new in their eyes to bring insights that they never thought about before. And so within my role, just like at Stanford, I'm always finding ways that I can add value. Because if you try to kind of jockey with someone over who's the smartest, 9 times out of 10, you probably will lose. And that's just not productive for anyone. So instead, I learned very early on at Stanford how to just be the best I could be while also adding value.
So I'll be brief. From a very literal and practical sense, my Stanford career, particularly MS&E, very much has enabled my startup pursuits. I actually went to Stanford with the intent of going into tech and going into startups because I'm a lot older than these guys. So I started right after the previous dot-com bust. And so it's just really reinforced and bolstered a lot of the things that have enabled me to create a tech startup, whether it be through the networks. I was also the first Black female to graduate from Stanford StartX Accelerator, which is really hard to do if you didn't go to Stanford. So yeah, from that sense, it's been really great. But also what I love about Stanford versus some of the Eastern Ivy League schools is that I think we're all just a little bit more hippie than our Ivy League counterparts in that we understand and embrace more ideals around social science and humanities, even though we are engineers. Just thinking about the ways in which technology is impacting the world and not just about how we can monetize everything. And so I think Stanford only enriched that sort of core belief, which has enabled me to start the business that I have.
Thank you, Stephanie. So the next question is, looking back at your time at Stanford, did you feel accepted and welcomed at Stanford as a Black student?
I was going to say yes and no. So I'll start with the yes. The yes was I never felt at Stanford like I was left out of any rooms or excluded from things because of my race. So that was one thing. And the actually other bigger yes, as someone who is a Black immigrant, without going into too many stories, I'm ethnically Ugandan. I was born in Kenya. I came in as an 18-year-old to Stanford, also with quite a bit of like uncertainty around my identity. And quite frankly, is at Stanford that like I came to embrace the moniker Black as like the thing that defined me. Like up until that point in my life, I was always like too Kenyan to be Ugandan, too Ugandan to be Kenyan. I'd gone to a British school for some time, so kind of too foreign. And at Stanford, I was just Black. I was welcomed as Black by the Black community. I still like have such a special place in my heart for the Stanford Black community because I think that was the first place I really learned what it felt like to belong in an identity and just be. So that is like a huge yes. However, when I look back, I think the yes and no is that the truth was outside of the Black community, there were a lot of places where I struggled with imposter syndrome, both like what would be classically expected of anyone coming to Stanford as a teenager, but also I think what as it uniquely affects people who are immigrants or who are Black, not seeing many people who look like them. And I think in those moments, quite frankly, in many of my classes, Stanford did not have the tools to help me on that journey, to understand what was difficult for me about attending office hours, right? Versus other people, to like make that space. And I know that's something that's been going on. But as I look back on my Stanford career, I think there were many moments where it just didn't feel like the environments or the spaces, particularly for the one-on-one relationships with some of my professors, felt like they were designed for me. And I think when I look back on some of the things I really regret, I wish I developed stronger relationships with administration and folks in there, but that never felt accessible to me in a way that I felt was certainly tinged for me by my race.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I can speak to it. So I am very, very Black. I'm the first in my family not to go to a historically Black college. I was conceived in Tuskegee, Alabama. Every descendant that I know of is a descendant of American slaves. So when I was introduced to what being Black at Stanford was, I was just amazed at how much intentionality went into it. So we had like a pre-admit thing here in DC that I went to, and then I was accepted into the Stanford Summer Engineering Academy that Noe Lozano ran for years. And that just 1 month alone, being introduced to the culture, the classes, I met some of my best friends, and it really enabled not suffering from as much imposter syndrome because I had sort of a cohort that I was coming into freshman year with. And I think under President Hennessy, I don't know how things have changed with the new administration, but I just remember feeling that it was a very top-down intentionality that Stanford did in terms of creating a space where we could feel like we belonged and we were wanted. But I will say, to Thomas's point, looking back on it and realizing all of the vast resources that my classmates, my white and Asian classmates, took advantage of that I never even knew about. I mean, it was almost like we went to two different schools. I like Stanford for me was a micro HBCU. I tell people because I was either the Black house or, you know, partying. But in retrospect, I think similarly, I just am amazed at just how different things were in terms of accessibility.
I can go next. So, like I said, I came from Atlanta. I came from Spelman. So, coming to Stanford, I had honestly pretty low expectations of the Black community because I knew it was going to be very hard to compare. But I will say I was pretty pleasantly surprised by how active the Black community was on campus. I think it's quite different as a grad student, to be honest. But I was active in the Black Engineering Grad Student Association. I think they had a lot of great events. I think that the community that I saw between the Black programs across the schools, so like the MBA, Black Student Association, the law school, I felt like we were really coming together. So I would say within the Black community, it was awesome. I think people supported each other and everyone was there for each other. I will echo the same sentiments as before. I will say that, just being honest, coming from Spelman, your professors care so much, and not that Stanford ones don't, but like your professors care so much. They reach out to you, they make sure that you're learning everything. Same thing with like the administration, almost everybody. And it also could be like a big school versus small school thing, but coming to Stanford, it did feel a lot different. And I was also a tutor while I was at Stanford. I was tutoring a lot of Black students. And so I would say that from like my experience tutoring there and also just being a student, there is like a special way that you can look out for Black students, making sure that understanding that people are coming from very different backgrounds, and that's why they could be reacting in different ways and in different situations, or understanding why like maybe they're not interested in that opportunity. Maybe they just literally didn't know what it like meant. Like I didn't know what computer science meant. So I do think that is a place where Stanford and MS&E in particular could improve. But I know that there have been like a lot of great efforts this year to make sure things like that happen. So I think that's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor what everyone else said, but I think the sentiment was echoed by Maya that it's easy to fall through the cracks. So if you, and yeah, again, and I tell everyone this all the time when I talk to them about Amazon, you are by far your biggest advocate, and you know, call that a pro or con of society or how our system is set up. I felt at Stanford that when I reached out or I knew exactly where to go for help or needed some resources, it was great. Like Stephanie said, Lozano, I tutored and CA'd or TA'd for Lozano, and he was incredible. And the community he built for not only Black students, but Hispanic students was great, always great. But for students who didn't know about his program, and I think Lozano actually did a really good job of reaching out to first year students, particularly students who were the first generation to go to college in their family. He did a good job of that. But I could easily see the cases in which if you don't know where to go, or if you're too scared to reach out, then you could kind of fall through the cracks at Stanford. And so, and I think that's just a general sentiment that we just should keep working on improving that and outreach however we can.
Thank you, Tyreek. So the next question is, have you faced any challenges as a Black professional in a particular industry or area of industry?
I can just dive right in. I mean, I think I kind of touched on that a bit in my personal story, but you know, I've centered my whole career around unconscious bias. And I do think a lot of the challenges that I faced in my career, despite having a lot of the shiny degrees, it's just based on the fact that I still show up as a Black woman who's, you know, barely 5 feet tall. So I think the way I have sort of changed my lens in dealing with the challenges of that bias is just not to allow it to impact my perception of my own self-worth, because it can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've also really prioritized strategic networking. So I'm a member of the Stanford National Black Alumni Association. I go to the summits every 2 years. And I try to be really, really active with that network, because in a lot of ways, it's been some of the limited opportunities I have to leverage just social capital.
Yeah, I just echoing kind of what Stephanie said. I think one of the hardest things, just to name it, about being, well, any minority, but we're talking about being Black, in a professional setting, is the uncertainty around whether it's affecting you or not. Walking into the room and being like, that didn't go well. Am I being crazy? Is this too much? Is this about me? Is it? And I actually think like that weight of like that second guessing yourself, that like is actually much more painful than like any whatever, some person making some racist decision over there. And so I just want to acknowledge that I think one of the things that's been hardest for me is it's not that I go out there thinking they're a bunch of racists, but needing to like evaluate every interaction that way is definitely a weight. And it's shown up in like different ways for me. So I just want to acknowledge like the reality of that. I love what Stephanie said around how being really strategic about your networks and figuring out where your energy goes in order to make that happen and how you allow it to influence yourself. I think one of the other things that I'm often thinking about is what's the flip side of that? I always tell, and again, whenever I speak to Black people, I'm like, I can tell that you, of all the people in the room, you probably have the most grit and resilience. And I don't need to know anything about your story except the reality of our world to know that you are walking into this room, had probably had to work 3 times as hard. You probably had to say no to stuff. And all that is strength and experience that you bring with you. You've also probably had to learn to be a master. I love you talk about storyteller. You have been translating across cultures in your sleep, right? And a lot of that thinking around like, okay, great. There's a lot I can't control, which is the negative, but what is it about being the constant outsider that is my superpower that I'm going to know allows me to walk in kind of a foot above everybody else in here because of that experience. And I found that like owning those things and thinking about those more has really helped kind of combat the other side of it, which is always the uncertainty around what is going on when interactions don't feel great.
I want to piggyback right on what Thomas said. To keep it brief, I think that yes, we all have fallen victim to the self-fulfilling prophecy for multiple reasons, mostly because data says that, there is a bias, an unconscious bias or a conscious bias, whichever. And yes, I go into meetings all the time where I'm like, that interaction felt off. And, a lot of the times I know it's not anything other than it was just an awkward interaction, but this mental power, or this power, or sorry, this put it this way, Black people in the professional world always have to reserve a little bit of their mental capacity to think about, things that their colleagues who don't look like them don't have to. Did I say the right thing? When that person saw my skin color, how did their tone change? How did their thinking change? Am I seen as, lesser to them? Am I seen as someone who, all these things that we have to do all the time, and it doesn't get easier. Like I'm only like 4 years into my professional career now. I'm sure Stephanie can attest even more as being the longest working here. It doesn't get easier. There are ways in which you can cope with it better and kind of compartmentalize it, but it's just something that, for better or for worse, you have to learn how to face. And I don't think it's STEM, obviously, it's exacerbated because of the nature of it, but it's not even just STEM. It's really kind of any field you go into where there are a lot of top performers there.
I would say for me, the biggest challenge was the lack of representation. I know we talk about this all the time, but I came into Stanford, I wanted to be a product manager, and I remember the first time I met a Black product manager. And I feel like that sentiment is not shared with a lot of my peers. Like, you don't have to remember that moment. And for me, I just enjoy looking up to people. And so when I'm in situations when I'm not saying there's nobody to look up to, but it's always nice to look up to somebody who looks like you. And when I don't see that a lot, it does affect my confidence. And even when I started at Dropbox, There were 3 Black PMs. I was one of them. We all started the same day. We were all like entry level. And so there was just literally nobody Black in my field above me. And honestly, if there was somebody, it probably wouldn't have affected my career directly in any way. Maybe we wouldn't have even gotten along, but just having somebody there to know that like they've done it, I can do it, that goes a long way for me. And I think the biggest challenge is that a lot of times I just don't get that.
I just wanted to comment on this again. So one of my hacks in given the space that I've been in, in venture capital, which is way more challenging than anything I experienced in corporate America, is kind of, I tell people I kind of like operate as if, I'm sort of in a Trojan horse, right? Like no one really expects people who look like me to really be smart. And given that I am, there are ways that you can use it to your advantage. So Thomas hinted on this a little bit in terms of, just kind of owning your power and owning the fact that you're bringing a diverse perspective. But I would actually double click on that and say, if you can figure out a way to internalize the ways in which people are underestimating you as an advantage, you'll get a lot further in your career. And so the way that shows up is, maybe you won't be considered for certain opportunities. Maybe you won't be top of mind when people are considering, promotions, advancements, et cetera. But when you do show up in a big way and outperform, it's only a 10x greater impact, because in a lot of ways they don't expect it. They haven't seen anyone who looks like you, who has been successful in that way. And so I would really suggest you figure out ways to turn that into an advantage and not a disadvantage.
Piggybacking off of your last, what you just spoke about, what advice would you give to students starting their careers now, especially URM students?
I guess for me, I would just say be open-minded to different careers. There's a lot out there, and you can come into school thinking you're going to do one thing, and it's totally okay to switch. And I came into college thinking I was going to do finance, then I thought I was going to be an engineer, and I thought I was going to be a PM. And honestly, each of those switches got me closer to something I actually enjoyed. So, and I think that when you actually enjoy your job, you do a lot better job at it. So, I would just say be very open-minded. Don't be stuck to like the career you think you're supposed to do.
And now, sorry, Thomas.
No, go for it, please, Tyreek.
I was going to say, and take this with a grain of salt because I am a PM now, but please don't say that you apply for PM roles just because everyone else is doing it. I know that, or apply for a job in machine learning and AI because everyone else is doing it. I know a big folly of Stanford, at least in my eyes, is that everyone takes CS 229, which is the big machine learning class. All these big tech companies come to campus and they're like, okay, if you're a CS major, you probably want to apply for a software developer role. If you like the business product UX side of it and you're technical enough, you can be a PM. I'd say just what Maya said and kind of what I discovered earlier on in undergrad is don't do things because other people are doing them. And it seems like, hey, this seems pretty lucrative. Let me just chase this down. Really internalize and have a conversation with yourself about what you want and what you want to get out of your career.
I would say, and it harkens back to something that was mentioned by both Maya and Stephanie separately at different points, but invest in your strategic relationships. I think kind of coming in, particularly as technical people, we tend to underestimate relationships versus non-technical people. I think then as like Black people who've had to work like twice as hard, you tend to then further underestimate them. Like we're very often, I think it is almost impossible for you to overestimate how much the right relationship is going to overshadow being excellent in making the right thing. And so as you think about your time, and yet I know for many of us that can feel like really yucky. So you kind of conjure up the image of the sleazy salesperson just talking to get what they want, and that just is anathema. I think it's actually more anathema in cultures for underrepresented minorities because we come from places where we really value people and don't want to use them. But Stephanie, I loved your example of the Stanford Black Alumni Network. Like you don't need to think about don't first invest in the strategic relationships that you think everybody else should go. Where do you feel comfortable? Where are people who see you, maybe even as bigger than you see yourself? What are the spaces where you find yourself enlarging? And how are you going to like just make that a priority to continue investing in those as part of your career? And look for those people, look for those strategic alliances in your job, through the alumni network, et cetera. Always be aware for those people are. And my experience is you don't know when they're going to come in handy, but they always do eventually.
So we actually have a question that just popped up, and I think it kind of relates to everything that you've been talking about. But how do you manage other people taking credit for the work you do? And have you experienced this in your career? Gender bias also comes into play as well.
I will say that I haven't experienced much of this directly, but I will say that I've always been lucky, and this kind of relates to the second Q&A question, but we'll get to that in a second. I've always been lucky to fall under managers that, well, not lucky. I quite literally will choose a job or not choose a job because of the manager. But the managers I've had, for better or for worse, if I didn't get along with them fully, one thing they always did was advocate for me, and I cannot express that enough. And so one thing that my manager does, I know you asked, have I ever experienced it directly? And the answer is quite frankly, no, because I always have managers who immediately when I do good work, they'll send an email blast out or something. Or if I send out an email, he'll like CC my director and be like, good job, Tyreek, on driving this. This is hard, blah, blah, blah. And I know that that's understated, but I cannot express enough again that managers, at least in your early career, really help define you and grow you and help make sure things like that don't happen.
Thank you for answering the question, Tyreek.
Oh, maybe I can go. I want to make sure other people got a chance, but I have experienced it.
Okay.
So with the, hey, for those of us who are not smart enough like Tyreek, when we were like deciding where to go and we ended up with like the wrong place, like, I think actually, Tyreek, there's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying. And just to underscore it, if you're in an environment where people are so unable to be creative on their own that they need to go and grab each other's work, that's probably not a place you want to be in long term. So Tyreek, I think there's real wisdom in like, you want to think about that environment and how you go in. But in the short run, because some of us have, for whatever reason, found ourselves there, one of the things that I've grown in realizing is you have a lot of control over who is aware of the work you're doing, simply actually by who you go to ask for advice and input. So one of the things I never do is just kind of go off and do my work on my own and then share it with my boss. That is way too small of a locus of control. Who are the people around who you want to know about your work, who you can approach, not just to like kind of show off, but to ask for input and advice? And it goes back to those strategic relationships. If you're out there engaging with people, it is going to be extremely hard for people to take credit for your work because there's a whole network of people who are involved in the process. And so I'd almost take it as a challenge. How can I broaden the network that I'm working with to get this work done? So it's harder to steal.
So we had another question from the audience. We still don't have a lot of diversity in tech and leadership. The excuses we often hear is the pipeline problem. How do we as allies of diversity and people from a diverse background overcome these barriers and help companies represent more diversity?
I have an opinion on this. I think there are like a lot of ways, and the way that I keep preaching, and this is particularly for like PM or even like a coding interview, something where it's like a very particular way you're supposed to prepare. Just being aware of the opportunities and resources, the candidates that you think are like, doing really well that they had versus other candidates. For something like a PM interview, I often compare it to like the SAT, where you can memorize the test, you can have the resources to get it done. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really reflect per se, how good you would be, or like, how good you'd be at a certain school. I think PM interviews are very similar, but I've noticed that a lot of people are getting credit for like the resources they were exposed to. And then a lot of people are at a disadvantage because they didn't even know these resources existed to know that they weren't even being credited for it. So I think when you are having like this pipeline issue or the diversity issue or anything like that, understanding the different backgrounds that people are coming from and the resources that some people might have gotten that others have not as you are making these types of decisions is extremely important. because a lot of times it reflects negatively on underrepresented minorities.
I chime in here. So in my organization, so I work in AWS networking, and this is actually a new problem we're currently trying to tackle. And to give you some specific examples of what our leadership is piloting is, a lot of these organizations you'll find are the less sophisticated ones when it comes to matters such as this, is that they actually don't have, a lot of them have metrics and goals around product and adoption and CSAT, customer satisfaction, but they don't have any goals around hiring, retention of diversity, how many people they want to move into leadership. So one example that we have from my organization is that we're currently, I believe, tracking a goal where we want to be able to measure how many, at Amazon, you have different levels. So L8 is a director level. We're measuring actually how many L8s of color, for example, we are able to not only move into the role, but retain. And how is that metric going to be? So there's one thing to set metrics, but then you also need actions to implement those. So one of the actions they're doing is that we have a lot of growth opportunities for high performers at lower levels. And one of the thoughts there is to start allocating more of those positions there for people of color. A lot of people of color in our organization just simply don't know about those, but it's not that they aren't high performers. They just don't have exposure to those resources, as Maya was saying, and they don't have that visibility. And so that's just some of the examples of how we're trying to solve it. I believe it, yeah, the problem definitely starts at the recruiting piece of it, but there's also this big piece about you get the diverse talent. Now, how do you ensure the work environment is safe and comfortable enough for them to stay and grow to a VP or C-suite level?
Thank you, Tyreek.
So yeah, obviously this is my entire line of work. What I've learned in the 5 years that we've been operating is that diversity is a very multifaceted problem. It's very much rooted in white supremacy and patriarchy and things that have been around for a very long time. And specifically within the US context, we've had affirmative action, we've had quotas. Those are all dirty words now. You might call them goals or KPIs now, but it's really, really hard to enforce on your own. A company left to its own volition rarely enforces those things in this day and age. So what we've done is just require that companies measure. So even before setting goals and benchmarks, like we believe you can't fix what you don't measure, and you also can't hold people accountable. So we created an index called Blend Score and a ranking that kind of mirrors like the US News World Report ranking, where we show you all 200 tech companies that we feature, what their score is, what their ranking is, their leadership team, their benefits, their policies, et cetera, in an effort to make like a competitive landscape around it. But I will say from my experience, a lot of people are looking for a quick and easy solution. And you're not going to find one. There's no silver bullet approach that can repair the really damaging structures that systematic racism have created.
Thank you, Stephanie. So
I'm about to look that up right now. Honestly, that sounds great.
yeah, definitely check out Blendoor. So the next question, I guess it's particularly just kind of within your own field of like what your, as far as your career goes, what trends or insights could you give about your particular field right now, especially given during COVID, during this time, pandemic? Oh, yeah.
Muted again. I can go. So I'm in the world of learning and development, and I think there are three major trends that we're just seeing kind of take over. I think the first is just-in-time learning. So how do you kind of shift from a model of learning that is like kind of let's all go through into like a big program to how do you have micro-learning that is available at just the right time? So for example, hey, if we're going to think about unconscious bias training or bias busting, you could put everyone through an unconscious bias training workshop, or every time a hiring manager is like about to open up a new rec, you show them like a 5-minute little like micro-learning on unconscious bias. And so that kind of shift. I think the second is a shift around like the personalization and personalized nudges. So how do we leverage AI to figure out what the right next action is? Shifting from learning as behavior acquisition to learning, from learning as knowledge acquisition to learning as behavior change. And so then the focus isn't like, what do you know versus what did you know after, but rather like, what are you going to do differently? And if that's the answer, like, well, we could hope that you know all the things to do, or we could nudge you at the right moment. And AI is really just the only way that we can do that at scale. And I think then the third piece, obviously that's driven by COVID, is now that everything has gone virtual, there's a huge pressure on how do we think about more social learning in a virtual world. So historically, the way that you got that social need around learning was get everyone in a room, take them out for drinks after or whatever. Now, how are you going to create some of those deeper, same connections as you're making that happen?
I can go. So my company sort of now sits at the intersection of social impact and the future of work. So thinking about in the fourth industrial revolution, when a lot of jobs will be automated, particularly jobs that are predominantly held by Black and Latino people, how will we ensure that we're upskilling on one side of the market? And then how will we ensure that companies are taking heed to the fact that there are certain demographics of people who are being disproportionately displaced and underemployed as a result of AI and automation. So the biggest trend I see is just around ways in which we are impacting policy. So that's part of the reason why I actually moved to the DC area, because we need to put more pressure on companies to be more thinking more about stakeholder capital and not just shareholder value. And then, whatever space is around, kind of to Thomas's point, around learning, e-learning, upskilling, virtual networking, like whatever resources we can make available, particularly to the demographics of people who have historically been disenfranchised.
Anybody else want to chime in before I ask the next question? Are we good?
I think I just want to say, just more on a personal level, with the headwinds of everything that's happening now, and probably the fact that remote working has certainly become more acceptable, and you're starting to really realize different people's work behaviors. I think the trend I'm seeing, and this is just probably generally applied to all different industries and fields, is that I'm finding that actually quite a few people don't know how to manage their time working from home. So a lot of people are working a lot more. Some people are working smarter and using this time to instead, work less hours but get more done. And I think I just want to button this up by saying the trend I'm noticing is that companies are going to continue demanding more from people. We've shown them now that a lot of us can be successful even in this remote world. So really just take the time you need. Don't overwork yourself. There's so much work to be done. It's okay if you drop something one day or 1 week and pick it up the next week. I know I'm always candid with my manager about this. I'm like, listen, Sean, I don't know. Like, there's all this stuff going on. And like today we were just talking. I was like, Sean, I'm probably going to take the day after the election off, honestly, because I don't know. I just get, yeah, Sean, I don't know. And he was like, yeah, do what you need to. Those things, be candid and be true to yourself about what you can and can't handle, and feel free to push back on if you're given a lot of work, especially now.
So the next question is, it actually was one of the submitted questions was what can we do to bend the arc of history towards a more inclusive future?
So I was just listening to a little mini TED Talk Ralph Nader did. Ralph Nader is the guy who put pressure on GM to make seatbelts mandatory because GM didn't feel like those were important. And I think that the topic of the TED Talk was around just how to really be a change agent when, a lot of pressures are against you. And I think, inclusion is one of those things where we haven't done a really good job with in this country. There are a lot of historical challenges in the opposite direction, but I would encourage people to just be bold. you may feel as though you can't take as much risk as you actually can. And I'm speaking from, again, a non-immigrant African American who, when I told my family that I was quitting Microsoft, they lost their shit, because it's like, you made more money in 1 year than most of us have made in a lifetime. How could you quit? And it's just like, I am investing in myself because I know that I can make a bigger impact, even though there's no precedence for what I've done. It just took an extreme level of courage, and also going against what I think culturally feels safe. You just have to take risks.
So there's another question that I think is important to ask, and it has to do with, I guess, what advice do you have for future alumni and students who are experiencing difficulties preparing for their future in the midst of COVID-19? So, potentially there could be a recession, and there's a lot to deal with there.
I can go. I'm curious then what others have to say. First thing I'd say is your career is long. I know that when you're in college or in grad school, what you do the next year, what you do the after that feels like make or break. But I think with a bit of hindsight, like looking back, actually, there are going to be more opportunities. There are going to be more things that come. Like actually, what you do every year matters. And so, great, this year some cards will come up, some cards will come down this year. This is a repeat game that you're going to be into for the long haul. And long-term success is not defined as much by like the one-off great chance, great economy, bad economy, but rather how you choose to show up day in, day out, year in, year out. So probably the first thing to do is like, you can kind of chill. Like this year will come, it will bring what it is going to bring, and then the next year after that will do it. But I think that kind of very similarly, it's don't neglect the basics. I think it can be in moments of uncertainty, it's really easy for us to forget the things that we do know, even as there are many things we don't know. We don't know exactly what the state of the economy is going to be over the next 12 months. We don't know. I have some of my hope who the next president is going to be. And it's like really easy to like think about, we don't know exactly what job you're going to land in, but like building your strategic relationships, continuing to develop expertise in the things you're deeply passionate about, having those informational interviews, absorbing, learning, that is going to be true no matter what the state of the world is. That is like the strategy for success when the economy is booming. That is the strategy for success when it is tanking. And so focus on those kind of core basics and continue to invest in them, and don't allow kind of the uncertainty outside to distract you from the path.
I want to double down on what Thomas just said. Specifically, I want to apply it to the MS&E students now. And I was in your shoes some like 2.5 years ago. It's when you are looking for jobs, as I said before, everyone is applying to Uber, everyone is applying to Lyft, everyone is applying to Waymo, everyone wants to work for a self-driving car company. These things sound so cool, but guess what? Those companies end up laying off 25% of their workforce during COVID, because that's just the way the world works. To reiterate what Thomas said, don't fixate on working for the thing that you think is the coolest at the time. Go back to the core values of what you want. I want to work in a data-driven org. That's great. Uber's not the only data-driven org, and there are a lot of other data-driven orgs that didn't lay off people during COVID. I want to have high visibility to leadership. Okay, great. That could be Waymo, that could be Lyft, that could be Google, that could be some company we've never heard of yet. And then also, like Thomas said, out of the onset of this, there are going to be so many opportunities like Zoom is now booming. These services that enable this micro working or this remote working are booming. These are the things that are suddenly innovating. So fixate on the core values. Don't worry so much about the products, I'd say. Obviously, it's great to think about the companies you want to work at for, how inclusive they are, etc. But yeah, just don't think less about the companies that are the sexiest at the time and more about kind of what you want to do long term.
I just 100% support that. I think my first piece of advice is similar to Thomas. It's so much easier said than done, but don't think about the things that are outside of your control at the moment. I was in your shoes, like I say 2 years ago now, like looking for jobs. And I know it can seem super scary. Like there are a lot of factors going into it, and there's so many things that you can't control of, like, is your interview after your final, or like, does this interview even like me? And just like things that you can't really worry about. But I would say the same thing as Tyreek. As far as when you are looking for a company and you do have some options on the table, for me, the culture is a huge part. And I didn't really think about that when I was looking at places. Like, I'm looking at PM roles. I'm trying to think about, the sexiest product, which is important to a degree. But two things, you might not be working on the cool thing of the product, but also you have to work there. And the culture is extremely important. And so I would say like really hyper focus on things like that. Like the people that you're interviewing with, do you actually like them? Like the environment, what people are saying about working there. I think that's like probably the most important thing. If I could have gone back and made a different, Dropbox did it very well, and that's why I learned that. But if I could have like reevaluated my priorities, I would have made that number one.
This is a little bit different from everyone's response, but I would say, also find your center, even if that requires you just taking a little bit of time off from school, from work, from the job hunt. I just spent a week in Moab, Utah, just hiking and reading and just trying to kind of recalibrate, because it's not just COVID. There's also Breonna Taylor. There's also, George Floyd. There's a lot happening right now that you can't even consciously recognize the impact and the toll that it's having on your decision making, and how the moves that you make next post COVID that could impact the rest of your life. So I'm a big fan of mental health days and just taking some time to step back and recalibrate.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm gonna try to open it up to everybody. So if anybody wants to ask questions in the audience, feel free. And then we had one more question from the audience that was submitted in the Q&A, and it says, thank you for participating in this panel as alums. What ways can we MS&E, the department, continue to support you in your career and help you stay connected to the department? When you're aware of positions opening in your company, will you reach out to us? But how can we support you as a department?
The things that I personally like to hear about the most, especially from Stanford, are the programs and new resources that you are giving to the Black students. And so I think as you think about outreach, I would love to hear those kind of updates. And I know that there are a lot going on with Andrea and Sean and the new committee on this. So I think that's super awesome. So the kind of support that I would love, on top of course, the resources that MS&E has, any updates on those programs, those are the kind of things that mean a lot to me. And it just shows that the department is moving in the right direction.
To answer the second part of that question, I definitely have done this before. I think I've sent Linda like a job rec before, and I was like, hey, this is a cool generalized opportunity for MS&E students. You should, send it out on the job listing. I think there are better ways we can do that though, because like I get like now I have a folder set up for job opportunities just internally at Amazon of all the different teams that are hiring that are actually targeting our Black employee network. And so I'm happy to keep forwarding those to you, Linda, but I'm sure there's a more scalable way to do that. I just don't know what it is. So in terms of that, yes, absolutely. Whenever I see a job posting I think is that an MS&E candidate matches the profile and it seems like a good fit and the team is good from a culture perspective, I can definitely forward it to you, Linda. But we should also just email about the best way to do that. Maybe it's a monthly, like, I don't know, thing you send out, Google form, where we put in all the different job recs for teams.
It's a great idea.
So I hate to bring this up, but Berkeley actually has this really great program called MET, M-E-T. I forget what it stands for, but they basically created a course for their current CS and business students to intern with a startup for a semester for college credit. So I got 5 Berkeley students for 3 months to work on a project that I chose, and of course that they advertised on our behalf. And we did pay like a nominal fee, but it was amazing. And I've solicited MS&E for some research interns and haven't had much luck. But yeah, I think for me, if there are any students that, want to work for a startup for college credit, that would be amazing for us.
Great.
I think first answer the question, absolutely yes. Right now, ServiceNow, the company I'm at, is growing by leaps and bounds. So like there are literally probably more technical roles available than it would make sense to forward. So I'd almost kind of put it out in maybe a slightly different way. If anyone listening to this or in the MS&E department is interested in a role at ServiceNow, please reach out to me in addition to applying. Let's get a chance to talk. Let me figure out how I can help you because I really want to. I think one of the ways that I would love for the MS&E department to continue to support us, and there's some of this ways, is kind of harking on this theme we've been chatting around strategic relationships. Are there ways that the university could more consistently foster connections between alums that would allow us to identify the ways that we can help each other in our careers? I think it's like one thing to go back, but like certainly I've used more help post university than I ever did in there. Even getting to meet the awesome people on this panel for sure has been such a gift. I would love it if there were there was more attention from the department on ways to foster those connections amongst us.
Thank you, Thomas. So do we have any more questions from the audience? I'm happy to unmute you.
So I wanted to add one thing of that just reminded me. I think another way that I would love to be connected, as I've been saying, I think like PM interviews and things like that, they can be hard to navigate. And so finding out about ways that I could help people do like interview prep, like I'm always very happy to like help with those resources because I know that I really appreciated that when I was at Stanford.
And I'll echo the same sentiment that Thomas did. I don't have quite the same power as Thomas does at AWS, but if you are searching the job openings and you see a rec that you so much believe that you are qualified for, please feel free to ping me on LinkedIn and get my email and send me your resume and I can refer you. And I typically, when I do that, I'll also reach out directly to the hiring manager via Slack and, ping them and say, hey, we have this candidate. What's the status there? So I'm definitely willing to extend that. I'm hoping at some point we can have a better and a more scalable process around that.
We don't have any more questions from the audience. Is there any last minute words of wisdom that you want to end with?
I can have some parting words. I will say that if there was something I wish an alum would have told me 15 years ago, is just that, you are exceptional. It's hard to really believe that, given you're surrounded by so many amazing people. But when you really get out into the world, you'll see very quickly just how talented you are. And there's going to, again, be a lot of things that happen that cause you to doubt that. But the more that you trust in yourself, and as we've talked about, leverage your networks, I think you'll make it.
I would say, similar to my earlier sentiment, just keep learning, keep being open-minded, keep exploring new things. You never know when you're gonna find something that you didn't know you were gonna like.
That's great advice. Tyreek or Thomas?
Well, I just yes and amen to Maya and Stephanie. Maybe just a nuance or like a double click is you're only at the beginning of your greatness. Amazing and exceptional as you are, over the next decade, the next 15 years, you are truly going to become incredible. And so kind of similarly to Stephanie's advice around kind of walking out and realizing you're amazing, keep checking in. I actually think it is impossible for you to realize how much potential you have. And I'd almost challenge you to think about whatever it is you think that is the max of what you can accomplish, and then multiply it by 2 and make sure you go after that. Because in general, you will never be able to overestimate what you are capable of. And what you're capable of is literally going to grow by leaps and bounds and compound over the next couple of years.
I think to steal Thomas's words from earlier, stick to your core and what you believe in and what you truly want to do. It's not about the coolest company. It's not about the coolest role at the time. or the coolest industry. It's about the core things that you want to learn and grow in as a individual and as a professional.
Thank you, everybody, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Tyreek. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Stephanie, for being here. It was a pleasure. I thought this whole session was wonderful, and all the, just insight, expertise, your experience as former students at Stanford and just professionals in the real world. So thank you for attending. Thank you for our attendees who are here. And I think we're done. So thank you.